Welcome to the first Egenis seminar of the new and exciting academic year. And as a great start to this wonderful seminar series, it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Devitt, who, to coin a phrase I'm sure needs no introduction, at least all the philosophers in the room will know some of his work, probably not all of it, because over a long and distinguished career, he's written on many areas, probably mostly known for work in the philosophy of language, I guess, but also in metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind. And more recently, which will be topic today, he has been contributing to the philosophy of biology.
That's where I went wrong.
Michael, I'm not going to try and do a biography because we wouldn't have time for, but just very briefly, for those who don't know, Michael grew up in this country, but then I think fairly early in life left us for a degree in Sydney and a degree in and a PhD at Harvard. Was it Harvard?
Yes, Harvard.
Harvard, yes, I thought. And since then, he spent, I suppose, the biggest chunk of his career in University of Sydney, but then has worked in Maryland, and most recently at Cuny Graduate School.
Yeah.
So the basic bones of the, but I won't try and introduce his work beyond what he's going to talk about today, which is, I guess, a characteristic of some of his work has been a certain contrarianism, and as he says often in his writing on this topic, there is a quite widely held consensus in philosophy of biology that biological kinds don't have essences. A heresy that I guess I've had something to do with defending myself, but Michael has set himself the task of correcting this misguided consensus and convincing us that actually all biological kinds, I think all biological kinds have essences. And that's what he's going to talk about today. And I am waiting to be corrected for my sins.
Yes, indeed.
Or not.
I'll do my best.
Yes, as the case may be. So without further ado, I'm delighted to ask Michael Devitt to speak to us.
Thank you, John. Yes, on my background, I was, as John said, I was actually brought up in England, but he missed the fact that I didn't start here. I near enough started in Australia, and I just came here as a little boy with my mother, who was seeking adventure, and was very successful at both. And I just came along the ride, and that's how I ended up being in England for 11 years. Okay, so in the last 20 years, I've got engaged with the philosophy of biology, and I was actually led into it by some work in the philosophy of language, which I'll spare you. And I've been pushing a line about biological essentialism, which John was just adverting to. This came to some sort of climax in a book I published 2 years ago called Biological Essentialism. In this, I argue for, you can follow along on the handout. Has everyone got a handout? It's important. So in the book, I urge a view of the essence of biological taxa, not all biological kinds, that they have partly intrinsic and partly historical essences. The intrinsic bit, I say, is probably largely genetic properties. And this bit of my view goes right against the consensus. In the book, I respond to many of my critics, but I don't take on a sort of criticism that comes from a much broader metaphysical perspective than you find from the critics I've dealt with, and particularly coming from your own John Dupré. in a whole series of works from his very early one. He wrote a lovely paper called Natural Kinds and Biological Taxa in 1981, and an influential work, and the book, The Disorder of Things. And these are the sort of main things I've got in mind as I talk about his views, but also a later paper or two. Now, John's rejection of my sort of biological essentialism is interestingly different from and more sweeping than that of the consensus, which I've dealt with in my book. For the consensus view is that a species has an historical essence, consisting of its particular place, as people tend to say, the place in the branching tree of life. In this respect, this commitment to a historical essence, in this respect, my essentialism accords with the consensus. In contrast, John rejects species essentialism altogether. Quote, species lack essential properties. Indeed, his general metaphysics of essence makes him somewhat skeptical of essentialism altogether across the board. This general metaphysics that he utilizes gives a special flavor to his disagreement with my biological essentialism, a disagreement that he asserts vigorously in a recently written but not yet published review of my book, where he nicely describes it's very vigorous criticism, and he just, the bits I like, he describes my metaphysics as obsolete, and my essence is mystical. Well, much of his disagreement with me stems from his general metaphysics, rather than from anything peculiarly biological. If those general views are right, were right, they would indeed count against most, if not all, essentialist doctrines. And I shall argue, well, this is a very long paper, which was stimulated by John, and I'm very grateful to him for stimulating, because I should have taken account of these sorts of general views before. My talk I'll just have to select out of a very long paper. So I will be skipping some things, and I will be very brief about others, and I'll try and focus on what I think is the most important aspect of my disagreement with John. I think that John's views on this metaphysics are largely mistaken, and I want to argue that essentialist doctrines, including biological ones, should have a place in our worldview. So I'm going to start off in the first two sections presenting my sort of general metaphysics of essences. And then I want to turn to John's contrary views. So I'm on to the section, all kinds of essences. I'm going to have to be pretty brief about most of this. On the handout, you've got it. Well, what is an essence? Well, the essence of a kind K is the property in virtue of which an object is a K. You can put this in many other ways. Whatever it is to be a K. What makes something a K? What constitutes something being a K? Not quite so good, but getting there. A necessary and sufficient condition for being a K. Similar definitions of kinds of stuff and kinds of properties and kinds of individuals, actually. Not kinds, individuals. Now, I use the term essence. We could go about why we're using that term. It's not important. If it weren't for the background of this discussion, I would have preferred to book of nature. But what I'm talking about, this property, is often called nature. It's sometimes called the identity, and in science, it's often called definition. It shouldn't be confused with semantic definition, because that's not what it is. The definition of water, so they say, is H2O. On the handout, some examples Gold. The essence of gold having atomic number 79. Notice that's an intrinsic essence. The essence of a pencil. It's an instrument for writing with a certain sort of physical nature. And that's what distinguishes it from a pen, which is also an instrument. So it's partly intrinsic and partly, it has an essence, partly intrinsic, partly relational. And then being Australian, the essence of that is entirely relational. And notice that all sorts of very different things have that property. Everyone's favorite Australian, Rupert Murdoch. The Opera House, Penfolds Grange, great wine. The expression, no worries, mate. All of those are Australian. And they have that property essence, and you all know why, because of a certain relationship they have to Australia. Entirely relational. Looking at the handout, it sort of almost follows from the definition I've just given, that every non-fundamental kind has a non-trivial essence. If it's a fundamental kind, if there are any such things, you'd only be able to give a trivial answer to the question that's raised here. But if it's a non-trivial, if it's non-fundamental, then it should have an answer, and it should be a non-trivial answer. Because there must be an explanation. It's not a brute fact about the world that something is a member of the kind. There's got to be some explanation of in virtue of what it's a member of the kind. And this is not to say that the explanation will be interesting. Indeed, it's the explanation that what you notice is that these kinds, the essence of the kinds, vary in interest enormously, from very interesting to not interesting at all. On the handout, I give you a totally uninteresting one. So, name the kind that consists of 3 randomly selected objects, A, B, and C. Let's call them blah. Being a blah is totally uninteresting, but it still has an essence, the property of being A, B, and C. So nothing special about having an essence. It's not reserved for interesting kinds. It's not reserved for natural kinds. I don't like to talk about natural kinds at all because I think it's a very unhelpful description. Or any kind of kind. It's not restricted to. Let's set aside Lockean real essences. That they are restricted. But I don't want to have any one bit I like to skip. So some further points about essences. They can't be reduced to modalities. There was an idea that was quite common until about 30 years ago that you could, many of us, including most influentially Kit Fine, think it's a mistake to think that essences can be reduced to modalities. In fact, the story is rather the other way around. Essences explain modalities. It's in virtue of the essence of, well, let me just leave it at that. I should add that all this talk of kinds, or properties for that matter, there's no commitment here to Platonic forms or abstract entities or any sort. It's a convenient manner of speaking, as indeed, if you challenge me, I can show how I can say it all without talking of kinds. Indeed, notice the way the initial question is posed, in virtue of what? Property in virtue of an object is, okay, you don't have to be quantifying over kinds here. But it's a very convenient way of talking, and that's where I'm going to put. Next section, why are essences interesting? Perhaps the crucial question is that after all, I'm so promiscuous, everything has an essence. So what we need to focus on are the ones that are interesting. And there's a crucial fact here, which I want to labor a lot. The essence of a kind explains its place in the causal nexus. What does this mean? It's because of its essence that the kind is the way it is and does what it does. Indeed, that it exists at all is partly explained by its essence. This is a very old idea, going back at least to Aristotle. Here's a quote from an Aristotle scholar. The essence of a kind, on the handout, has an explanatory role in that it is adverted to when explaining why an instance of the kind has the properties and behavior patterns that it does. This idea about essences being explanatory is acknowledged, of course, in the philosophy of biology literature. Elliot Sober, another eminent philosopher of biology, says, has a nice statement. John, not an enthusiast for essences, but he notes this as a widely held view. Oh, in fact, I got a quote from Sober, I see on the handout, so you can read the quote. Something about any kind, so what's the claim here? Something about any kind causes its members to have its, to use the quote of Egenis, causes it to have its properties and behavior patterns. Indeed, what else? We could argue about this, but what else could that something be but whatever makes it the kind it is? So its essence. So in recent times, Antonella Maluzzi has come up with this nice way of describing this property of an essence. An essence of a kind is super-explanatory. Why is this celestial body turning hydrogen into helium? Because it has the essential nature of stars, and that's what stars do, at least at a certain point in their life. Now, not only so, I'm reading from the handout, not only scientific kinds have their places in the causal nexus because of their essences. For example, paperweights do, and bronze does. Why does a paperweight hold down paper? Well, because that's what paperweights do. Why do they make good weapons? Well, it's because they have a sort of nature essence that it gives them properties such that they make good weapons. So all of these properties of paperweights are explained by their nature or essence. And this is not scientific kind, you notice. All kinds, as I say, not just natural ones, have essences, and aside from the likes of glass, which of course is an extreme example and of no interest, all kinds have a place in the causal nexus that is explained by those essences. Some further points at the bottom of page 1. The properties of a kind are caused partly by its environment. Obvious point. So it's not the properties of a kind. Even one of my favorite examples, African rhinos have 2 horns, Indian rhinos have 1 horn. Well, when we say that, we have in mind the normal environment for African and Indian rhinos. Change enough of the environment, and you won't get them having those horns. Secondly, here's the claim, given any environment, the essence causes the typical properties of the kind in that environment. The essence explains the law-like generalizations, as Indian rhinos have 1 horn, African rhinos have 2. I'm going to skip point 3, which was stimulated by a recent paper, which I think is quite misguided. I'll go to point 4. Atypical, atypical properties of kind member are explained otherwise, not by it being a member of kind. What is the explanation of the properties of the atypical members? Well, they may be of a kind. They may be explained by their membership in another kind. Let's take some examples. The fox, Rufus, a particular animal, being the true fox of Volpes, explains his partially retractable claws. Could all true fox Being a vulpes, however, explains his bushy tail with a white tip. So being a vulpes, a true fox, does not explain that, because lots of foxes don't have bushy tails and white tips, in particular the Arctic foxes. And of course, there are other properties that Rufus may have, which are explained by other kinds of member with different sorts of essence. Being a predator explains Rufus's behavior in the henhouse. Some of his behavior may be explained by his being a member of social kinds, socioeconomic kinds, like his property of being edible. Or a pit. Of course, Rufus has his own peculiarities. Perhaps, for example, he is three-legged. This may be explained by his individual essence. He was some sort of mutant, or it may be explained by an unhappy encounter with a trap, in other words, by the environment. The essence is interesting to the degree that its kind's place in the causal nexus, explained by the essence, is interesting. This is how we arrive at the degree of interest. To the degree that what brought the kind into existence, and the properties of the kind caused by its essence are interesting. It's how much that causal story is interesting. That basically accounts for the degree of interest in the kind. Essences of blahs have no interest. Essences of suns have an interest. Very interesting. Theoretically interesting. That is to say, here we come up with an essence, a scientific essence, which, as we might say, helps tell us about the way the world is. I take it as sort of a rough way of getting at what science is after, a scientific interest, and the essence of stars is terrifically interesting for that. The essence of Australian is, of course, very little interest in it as a kind, pretty close to blast, but it has some causal role, some causal. Here's an example. You can imagine this explanation of why Nigel will not drink a Penfolds grain. Well, he's been so upset by the cricket that he won't touch anything Australian, right? So there you've got Australian as an explanatory notion. Of course, not very interesting, but it's just a little bit interesting. What you can say, insofar as being Australian is interesting at all, it's practically interesting. It's not theoretically interesting. Now, John, in his early stuff, drew our attention to the way in which ordinary folks' biological categorizations are influenced by practical concerns. Perhaps not theoretical concerns at all, but I think maybe a bit of each. If you look at something like water, it seems that our classification of it is probably largely practical, but probably a little bit theoretical, because the folk, God bless them, right from the beginning, were interested in not just in practical things, but they were interested in understanding the way the world is. So you had from the beginning, I'm optimistic about the species, there was predator science going on. And so it may be that John's lovely examples of, what was it, the lilies and, I've forgotten what you were.
Pets.
Maybe what's going on there is partly, largely perhaps practical, but partly theoretical. And I have recently got into experimental semantics, which, to the horror of many people in semantics who think this is a vulgar intrusion on the comforts of armchair semantics. And one of my experiments with a collaborator seems to show that rice, in fact, fits exactly that pattern. That is, that it's rice is a kind that, as picked out by the folk, which reflects the categorization, reflects the practical interests, of course, that we all have in cooking with it and eating it, but also the theoretical interest we have in the way the world is. Final question on interest. Why should we care about essence? Well, first, we have a practical and theoretical interest in the causal role of kinds, in virtue of what kinds, the members of kinds play their causal role. So that gives us an interest, since it's because they have their essence, particular essence they play those causal roles and have their place in the causal nexus. That's the second point. Super-explanatory essences do that explanatory work. So we should be interested, and it seems to me clear that in science we are. We're interested in the essence or nature of gold, water, genes, and my friend Egenis drew my attention to just think of medical science and the enormous amount of work that went into trying to figure out the essence or nature of the Black Death, mountain sickness, and scurvy. Of course, what people are interested in here may not be conceptualized as essences, may be conceptualized as natures, or just identity, or just definition, or well, doesn't matter which of these terms. The important thing is where they're interested in a certain property, which I'm calling in essence, which plays a super-explanatory role. And I think this is such interest as all through science. Now, God, time is going away. I'm moving on to John. Now, I'm just going to have to skip some of this and get to what I think is the really interesting disagreement that John and I have. So I'm sorry, I'm just going to pass over this with just a brief remark. First, individualism. Conceptualizing objects that form a kind as an extended individual rather than a kind. This has been a popular idea among philosophers of biology in biology. And there is an idea afoot that if you conceptualize kinds, species, say, as individuals like this undermines essentialism. I don't think it does at all. I've argued this. I don't know of any response to the argument, so I'm just going to pass over it. You can read the comments there. Indeterminacy. John thinks that for a kind to have an essence, it must have sharp boundaries. I don't think this is so at all. I think it can be have indeterminate boundaries, and indeed, I think virtually it can. But well, I'm known for not being bold. I think every kind is indeterminate, outside perhaps mathematics and logic. So every indeterminacy is everywhere, and indeterminacy is actually irrelevant, it seems to me, to the essentialism issue. But I'm not alone in that. Even some philosophers of biology who are anti-essentialist agree with me about that. Variation and change. Now, John, and indeed this is quite standard in philosophy of biology, think that the facts of variation and change, which we all know about from in this post-Darwinian age, and also which are emphasized in the Darwinian story, a consensus, a common view, I think, that this is in some way contrary to essentialism. I don't think it is. I've argued it at great length. I know of no rebuttal of these arguments, so I'm going to pass over that too. Taxonomic pluralism. I want to not be quite so brief on that. John urges taxonomic pluralism. Sometimes he calls it promiscuous realism. Quote, there are countless legitimate objective, I'm reading from the handout, objectively grounded ways of classifying objects in the world. I don't know that I embrace it with the enthusiasm that John does. I've sort of embraced it a bit, and I've certainly got nothing against it, though he thinks I have for some strange reason. In fact, I've been sort of making pluralistic noises from the beginning of my career, and most particularly when it comes to the category issue in biology. So I don't have anything against this pluralism, but it is, in my view, irrelevant to the essentialism issue. So what we've got here with the four things I just described, we've got views that individualism, where there are claims are made, which I mostly don't disagree with, which are alleged, made by John and by others sometimes, which are alleged, if true, to count against essentialism. And I say they don't. I argue they don't. But now we get to this one, and I'm going to spend the last of my time on this. So we really hardly get to biology at all, because this is all background, but I think it's very important background. And this is the issue of classification. I think if John and I think at bottom, this is really the serious disagreement that I have. But I'm a bit bemused by what John says here, and I don't think he could really mean what he says. Okay, so I'm going to be careful with this. John rightly attributes to me the view that scientific classifications explain. You've already heard me about this. He's right. I'm really enthusiastic about that. In contrast, he doesn't think they explain. This is what he says. He doesn't think classifications in biology, anyhow, need to explain anything, and charges that my, quote, assumption that they do is grossly question-begging. Well, setting aside the likes of Lars, I argue in effect that all classifications, whether scientific or not, explain. For classifications, pick out kinds, and I've argued all kinds have essences which are explanatory. Indeed, super-explanatory, to use Antonella's nice phrase. So there's no question begging here. This is what I argue. John also takes me to believe that it is, quote, the job of science to discover the antecedently existing scenes in nature, to distinguish the above-mentioned pre-sort, I didn't mention because I cut out of this, to distinguish the pre-sorted natural kinds and to identify their essences. He thinks that's what I think, and he's right. I do think that identifying essences, but I think it's only one job of science. There's also, of course, the job of discovering the laws that hold because of those essences. For example, it was the discovery of the laws of inheritance, Mendelian laws of inheritance, that drove the discovery of the nature of the genes that have the causal powers that ground those laws of inheritance. So my view is that in scientific classification, we aim to identify kinds that are adverted to in causal explanations and laws that hold because of the essential nature of those kinds. In contrast, John claims that, quote, only the fantasy of essences makes classification look like the search for explanation. And he claims the idea that the business of science is the business of science to discover the essences of natural kinds has been thoroughly refuted by the actual course of scientific discovery. Well, note that these are pronouncements about the classification in science. not just biology, and the business of science, not just biology. But they're so wild that I rather doubt that John actually believes them. In any case, he should. So let me get to these issues. So John's discussion is largely about classification in biology, which he clearly thinks differs from scientific classification in general. But in this part, I'm just going to focus on classification in general. The view of classification in general that emerges from John's discussion does not support these wild pronouncements. Thus, in his very interesting book, The Disorder of Things, John claims that, quote, the most important desideratum of a classificatory scheme is that assigning an object to a particular classification tells us as much as possible about that object. It is indeed common to think of classifications as information stores, in the happy phrase of Strone and Griffith. And John has here, in what he says here, the appealing idea that these stores, put it sort of metaphorically, should be as full as possible. But question, what's in the store? Well, suppose we classify an object as a K. Then the content of the information store for this classification is obviously a collection of known generalizations adverting to Ks. Thus, classifying a newly observed celestial body as a star tells us a whole lot about it because of the known generalizations about stars. So that's why this is so valuable. But it's important to note that these generalizations yielded by the classification are valuable only because they're law-like. They comprise a theory of stars. If it were a mere accident that all stars observed so far had a certain property, then the classification would not tell us that the newly observed object that is a star has it. Question, what makes the generalizations about Ks law-like? The essence of Ks. It's because of the very nature of Ks that those laws adverting to Ks, and hence explanations of particular Ks, hold. So, getting back to John's phrase, the most important desideratum of a classificatory scheme is really that it assigns an object to a particular classification with an explanatory nature that yields a law-like information store. So here I've sort of developed John's initial remark in a way, his desideratum, in a way which brings with it an interest in that explanatory nature. So this is very much my sort of view, and quite at odds with John's rather wild pronouncement. So you can see my view of scientific classification ties it to the demands of theory and explanation. When John is not talking about biology, at least sometimes he seems to agree. Thus, in a later paper, John has this to say about classification in chemistry and social theory. I quote, it's quite a long quote. It's often assumed, and perhaps this is on the handout, I'm not sure. It's often assumed, and I have made just this assumption myself, that classification in science must go hand in hand with theory. Progress in chemistry, for instance, is immediately reflected in improved classification of material stuffs. And modern chemistry is enshrined in the periodic table of the elements, both a scheme of classification and a vehicle for a good deal of chemical theory. Pure chemicals are the best surviving candidates for the traditional concept conception of natural kinds demarcated by the common possession of real essences, which I've skipped over, of course, realism. And this is a very nice and interesting extra remark John makes. Something very similar may be seen at the other end of the spectrum of organizational complexity. If Marx's social theory, for instance, have merit, then it should be theoretically illuminating, or anyway should once have been, to classify people as proletarians and bourgeois. But of course, no one thinks that all proletarians share a common real essence. End of quote. So I say, what do I say? Right. Proletarians do not share a real essence. Nonetheless, because a real essence is something specially defined, which I've gone into, particularly something intrinsic. Nonetheless, they do share an essence. And I'm going to tell you what it is, because I've read my Marx. It's the property of selling their labor to the bourgeoisie for a wage. And in contrast, the bourgeoisie share the essence of owning the means of production. And this is where this is the important thing. Marx's social theory is very interested in these essences because they underpin many Marxist theories and explanations. So social classification in social science does indeed go hand in hand with theory, as John says, and an interest in essences. Similarly, in chemistry, as John seems to agree, classification into kinds is a vehicle for a good deal of chemical theory. And those kinds are demarcated by the common possession of real essences. So in summary, contrary to John's pronouncements, essences are no fantasy, and they do indeed show that classification is a search for explanations. Furthermore, the actual course of scientific discovery, exemplified in chemistry and social theory, supports the idea that it is the business of science to discover the essences of kinds. Not the only business. Then I think what John says in his Calm the Moment supports that. So the picture we have drawn of science in general, I want to say, applies to biology in particular. Now, John, whatever he thinks about science in general, I'm not sure how much we actually disagree on that. He certainly thinks things are different in biology, and I, unfortunately, don't have the time to argue the biology case. So I'm going to go to section 5 and just draw your attention to the discussion here. First of all, what exactly is my doctrine of essentialism? Well, it's there at the beginning of section 5. I've labeled it taxon essentialism. The essence of a biological taxon is an intrinsic underlying, probably largely genetic property that members of the taxon have as a result of descent from members of a certain different taxon, hence with a different essence. The first part of that is the sort of intrinsic part, and the last part is the historical part. There are two sorts of explanations we need to satisfy. I don't know that I've got time to go into this. Basically, historical sorts of explanations. Essence has to provide these historical explanations. Why? Well, let's take the structural explanations first. It has to provide structural explanations, which amounts to why does an organism, say a tiger, why does this organism develop to have the particular phenotypic properties it has? An ontogenetic property. But then there's the other sort of phylogenetic issue. How does it come about that there are these organisms with the sort of underlying intrinsic essence that leads them to have the phenotypic properties they have. How does it, to take a lovely example that came from Stephen Gould, how did it come about? There, give you the two, the structuralism. How does it come about that a giant panda develops to have an opposable thumb? Very unusual property in a bear. That's the structural question. What's the explanation of there being these bears with opposable thumbs? That's the historical explanation we need to provide. And I want to say that the essences we need, all these explanations are what I there characterized. There's a lot there I'm simply going to skip over. Just want to make one final remark. Here we're talking particularly about biology. John,
sorry, just to say we're not quite as pushed for time as we used to be.
Unfortunately, I've already skipped over. You needed to have told me that in the beginning, and I would have changed it. But at this point, all you're doing is going to indulge me if I go on a bit for the final amount, which I've got. So too late. She cried, waving her wooden leg. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, that's a quote. Yes. Not John. Not John. Particular objections that John has concerning biology, which I felt I needed to say more, and I'm going to skip over most of it. But pluralism, John wants to have it. I've already said, and I emphasize it again more here, I have no problem with pluralism in biology. But pragmatism. Notice that I quote John, he says, classification in biology is a thoroughly pragmatic, and he wants to urge a thoroughly pragmatic and pluralistic approach to biological taxonomy. As I said, I'm not arguing about that. What about the pragmatism? Well, I'm reading from the handout. I'm of course right with John that classification often is often driven by practical interest. No doubt about it. But I've argued, well, let's see what he says. His examples of folk classification of organisms, which we've already mentioned. The lilies, I've forgotten. He's got some lovely examples. Lilies, I remember, was one of them. So they're very good examples of classification. And then he mentions foresters, conservationists, gamekeepers, and herbalists, all of whom are involved in classifying biological organisms. No problem with the idea that they may be partly guided by practical concerns. And so, as I said, I'm not at all against the idea that practical interest guide a lot of classification. But my taxon essentially is not about these classifications, what's going on with the herbalists and so on. So my line is this: the classification of chemists and social theorists are driven, that is, scientists are driven by theoretical concerns, so too biologists, including ecologists, ethnobiologists, or ethologists. Indeed, I wonder what practical concerns could have. So I perhaps am going a bit over the top there. Maybe you can find a few classifications of taxa. Look, now let me speak. Let me, John, give up correcting me. So I'll leave it. Inside, John's view that biological taxonomy is pluralistic, is compatible with taxon extension. I reject his view that taxonomy is partly pragmatic. I'm going to skip the other standard objection, which is concerned with the species concepts and so I've addressed this at great length. I know of no rebuttal of what I've said, so I'm just happy to let it stand. We can, and then finally, I couldn't resist being rude to John at the end. He's just dodging the question. The essentialist question. In virtue of what is an organism a member? An organism a member. Okay. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.